Hey everybody, welcome back to the wood shop.
In today's video, we're going to be making an end grain cutting board.
Yeah, that's right. All you'll need is two contrasting hardwoods, and we're going to be using maple and cherry.
This is a relatively simple design, which is great for beginners.
Now, we used a website called Cutting Board Designer JS, and we've laid out a checkerboard pattern here, which is the simplest pattern you can use for an end grain cutting board. We'll leave you a link in the description below if you want to use this pattern or design your own board.
While this is a relatively simple end grain cutting board, it will take multiple stages over several days to complete. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, the first thing we're going to do is cut some sections off of these boards. The goal is for our end grain cutting board to be 16.5 inches long. At a bare minimum, we're going to have to start with 18-inch boards. But we're going to give ourselves a buffer and cut 20-inch sections off of each board here. You have a lot more waste when you make an end grain cutting board because you have multiple cuts, several more cuts than an edge grain cutting board.
Alright, the squares in our checkerboard pattern are going to be 1.5 by 1.5. So that's the first step, is to get these boards planed down to 1.5 inches. And we're going to have to run them through on the planer sled, shim them up, make sure we get one true face. That way all of our boards are good and square. And now it's table saw time. We're going to joint one edge of these boards to get a clean side to run up against the fence. Then we're going to cut them up into 1.5 inch strips. Well, I thought about it and I realized that if we want to keep these squares 1.5 by 1.5, we're going to have to cut these strips at 1 3/4 inches. That way we have some extra to plane after our first glue up. Okay, we've got the old pipe clamps out here and what looks like the beginning of a really thick edge grain cutting board. And the reason for that is because on our first glue up, this will be an edge grain cutting board. Now the reason it's so thick is, like I said before, after we get this out of the clamps, we're going to have to plane about 1/4 inch off of it just to make sure it all joints up really good.
Alright, we've got some Tight Bond 3 wood glue because this is a cutting board, so it will be exposed to water. And we've also got some cauls and several clamps, so let's go ahead and get this clamped up. We're going to let it sit overnight and come back to the next stage tomorrow.
Alright, now it's the next day. Our board has set overnight and we've got it out of the clamps.
The next thing we need to do is chip off all of this dried glue. Then we're going to send it through the planer, make sure that both sides are nice and flat, and get this down to 1.5 inches thick. before we start ripping our 1.5-inch strips on the table saw, we've come to the miter saw just to clean up the edges of this board and make sure they're nice and flush.
Okay, now the planer did leave some snipe in a couple spots on this, so we went ahead and sanded this down, and I think it's pretty good and flat now. We shouldn't have any trouble with it. But right now it's time to cross cut this into 11 1.5-inch strips. Now we cut it up and we're going to put it straight back together.
Not straight though. We've got a checkerboard pattern here, so as you can see, when we put together the original edge grain cutting board, we started with cherry and we ended with maple, and there's a reason for that. When we glue this up this time, we are going to alternate the pattern. That's why we cut everything into strips again. So instead of it looking like this, just stripes, you just rotate every other board, and that gives you that nice checkerboard pattern. This is also going to be an end grain cutting board, so we're actually going to be putting the glue along this edge here, and then you can see this side right here. This is the edge grain, or the end grain rather. It's kind of ugly right now. It's got burn marks, but a sander will take care of that. So let's go ahead and get this glued up.
It's another day and our end grain cutting board is dry and out of the clamps.
The next thing we're going to do is run over to the table saw. We might walk, actually. Running doesn't sound that safe, but we're going to take this over to the table saw. And one thing that we've noticed when we try to clamp a board together is the ends don't meet exactly flush. And so we typically do have to cut those edges off just so we have a nice, clean, square board. If you have any tips on how we can keep these edges nice and flush, leave us a comment below. But we're going to go over and cut a nice flush square edge all around this board. So normally with an edge grain cutting board, we would just run the whole board through the planer, but this is end grain. No bueno, bad idea, because if you run this through the planer, it can hurt you, so don't do that. So we're going to sand this down. It's going to take quite a while. We're going to start out pretty intense. We've got some 60 grit on our sander here. Go ahead and put me in some earplugs, grab my mask, and let's get to work.
know that was a lot of sanding. I would suggest if you're going to be making a lot of these, get a drum sander.
Amen to that. We went through 60, 80, 120, and 220 grit.
And you can see, I don't know if you can see it or not, but we also did what I like to call a sander chamfer around the corners of this. It's just a little tiny 45-degree chamfer around it, just to keep everything from being so sharp.
The next thing we're going to do is pop the grain on this board, make those fibers swell up, and then we'll give it another sanding.
Alright, now the grain's been popped and our board has been resanded to 220. We're going to put some of these little feet on the bottom, probably about 1.5 inches in from each corner.
All right, it's my favorite time of the project. It is time to finish this board. We have some white mineral oil here. It is food safe. It says that it's chemically and biologically stable and does not support bacteria growth, which is great because this will have food on it. We don't want bacteria in our food, right? This is end grain, so it'll probably take quite a bit more oil than an edge grain board, and so we're just going to keep giving it a drink until it is fully absorbed. I'm excited. Let's go ahead. As you can see, we have sufficiently oiled our board. The last thing we're going to do is give it a nice wipe down with this board butter, board conditioner, whatever you want to call it. We do make this ourselves. It's very easy to do, and we have a video about how to make this particular board butter, so you can check that out. If you don't want to make your own, you don't want to order the supplies, you can just order the actual conditioner itself. It's out on our website, and every sale helps support this channel. So we're just going to wipe some of this out of the tin and start rubbing it into this grain. We're going to let this conditioner sit for just a little bit and soak into the board. When it starts to get a little bit cloudy, we'll go back and buff it out to a nice shine.
And now we have ourselves a simple checkerboard pattern end grain cutting board. It takes a lot of sanding and a lot of oil.
It is so beautiful, though. I love the contrast of the maple to the cherry. We talked about maybe gifting this out, but it's going to be really hard to do. It is such a special piece. We really do like the way this board turned out.
If you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And if you want to stay up to date on all the projects we're doing here in the wood shop, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also check us out on the web at woodsongsbyrussell.com, and we're also on Facebook.
Thanks again for joining us today. Until next time, happy woodworking!